Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The thinking atheist. It's not a person. It's a symbol. An idea.
The population of atheists in this country is going through the roof.
Rejecting faith. Pursuing knowledge. Challenging the sacred.
If I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth. Not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish.
And working together for a more rational world.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way.
Assume nothing. Question everything. And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist Podcast. Hosted by Seth Andrews.
If you know me, you know how much I love to tell stories. This is an assembling of 12 different true stories, stuff that I have featured on my other show, but I just wanted to bring them together here as a nice distraction. Weird history, interesting stuff from decades, even centuries past, entertainment for you and yours. So here we go with some stuff that you may not have heard that actually happened, real events involving real people. Here we go. I'm Seth Andrews, and what you're about to hear is a true story. For celebrity, influence, and even power, few positions rival that of the Supreme Pontiff, the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope. Now, the Church is no stranger to strange stuff, but one centuries-old court case ranks right up there. In the 9th century, popes were very much political animals, even more so than today. They had the power to appoint various political rulers. Pope Formosus ruled the Papal States from October of 891 to April of 896, 5 years. But his tenure was a troubled one. Lots of maneuvering and taking sides and validating one group while invalidating another. The details are really, really messy. But the short version is this. Pope Formosus was involved in a big blow-up over the coronation of Charles II, which angered a ton of powerful Catholics. Power players turned on him. He had to flee Rome. He was excommunicated from the church. But over the course of time, he would go on to get a pardon. He would return to Rome. And then he decided he was going to liberate Rome from the current emperors. He was going to have an alliance with a guy named King Arnulf of the East Franks. He was going to use King Arnulf's army to mobilize an attack on Italy. There would be an overthrow. I mean, it was just a big, complicated thing. But both men, Formosus and King Arnulf, fell ill, so this anticipated liberation of Rome fell apart. So are you with me? Pope Formosus had angered political power players. He was excommunicated. He was removed as pope, ran for his life, got a pardon, and then tried to come back for a grand takeover of the Rome that he had just been kicked out of before his plans fell apart. Now, his successor as pope was Stephen VI. And Pope Stephen would never forget the scheming and the betrayals of his predecessor. He was so enraged that he ordered Formosus to be brought up on charges where he would have to answer for his crimes against Rome, against humanity, against God. Formosus was accused of violating canon law. He was accused of perjury. He was accused of usurping the papacy and violating the will of the Almighty. So there he was, in the courtroom, former Pope Formosus. He was sitting stoically, dressed in his ecclesiastical robe as the charges were argued in front of him. He was being defended by a church deacon who articulated the best defense he could muster, but it was all for nothing. This was a show trial. On top of that, an earthquake hit the region right in the middle of the proceedings. That seismic event was portrayed as the righteous indignation of God himself. So it's no surprise that Pope Stephen VI would see his guilty verdict. He would oversee the punishment of the betrayer. All of the former pope's consecrations, appointments, and ordinations were instantly nullified. His robes were stripped from his body, and he was dressed in filthy rags. 3 of his fingers were hacked off. These were known as the fingers of consecration, used to give blessings. And Formosus was thrown into the Tiber River. This was a common practice against Rome's most infamous criminals. This was a place of disposal for the garbage. For centuries, the Tiber had swept away the bodies of political rivals, emperors, Christian martyrs, and enemies of the people. Legend says that even Pontius Pilate had been tossed into the Tiber. Pope Stephen VI had had his revenge in 897 CE, but his victory would not last long, and neither would his reign. Stephen himself would be soon removed, imprisoned, and killed. And yet the history books don't remember Pope Stephen for his own death. He is remembered for putting a predecessor on trial, a show trial, with the guilty verdict all but guaranteed. That court case has been made all the more famous with this knowledge. The knowledge that the accused, Formosus, who was sitting adorned at attention in the defendant's chair, the man who said not a word, well, he didn't say a word because he couldn't speak. Formosus had been dead for months. Pope Stephen had been so outraged that he ordered his enemy's corpse to be dug up for the trial. He wanted to see that face, the deceased and decaying face of Formosus, as the trial was held and the verdict rendered. And when Formosus was stripped, dismembered, and tossed into the Tiber, he couldn't feel a thing. So now you know the history. The account from 1128 years ago about a living pope who tried a dead one, and who, in that Roman court, as the accusations flew, literally looked death in the face. I have always envied people who can draw. I am in awe of Stephen Wiltshire, who is really good at drawing cities. And I mean detailed drawings, tremendously impressive work, and he does it all freehand. I mean, the guy drew New York City. 305 square miles of the Big Apple depicted on a 19-foot-long canvas. Stephen sees it, he draws it. What a remarkable gift. Yet until he was 5 years old, Stephen had never uttered a single word. Born with autism, all verbal languages seemed like foreign languages to him. People wondered if he would ever say anything until one day in his kindergarten class at a London school for autistic children. It was a special day, the whole class going out on a field trip, and when they returned, Stephen spoke. He said the word paper. The teacher asked him to repeat his request, and again he said paper. Then she asked Stephen if he could speak another word, and he did. He said pen. Well, quickly, Stephen Wiltshire was given paper and pen, and he began to draw the places he had just visited. Using this newly discovered sense of place, his instructor was able to teach him the alphabet by associating letters with each of the buildings that Stephen drew. A for Albert Hall, B for Buckingham Palace, Z for the zoo, that kind of thing. Stephen's parents started entering him in art competitions, with each drawing bringing fresh attention and new admirers. Stephen himself couldn't really understand why he was getting so much attention, why what he was doing was so remarkable, why would so many people care? In a BBC interview about her son, Annette Wiltshire said, quote, that he has a gift makes no sense at all to Stephen. He knows that he draws very well, but he picks that up from other people he sees, the warmth on their faces. They tell him how much they like his work, and that makes him very happy. He loves the attention. And Stephen would continue to get attention for the work of his pencil, including attention by CBS's early show. In 2009, they asked this young prodigy to draw New York City in glorious detail. They provided a helicopter so Stephen could get overhead references to everything. And when Stephen was done with the surveys, his canvas was prepared at the prestigious Pratt Institute. And over the course of 4 days, with headphones playing tunes from his iPod, mentally immersed in this fresh cityscape, Stephen drew most of Manhattan, the Hudson shoreline of New Jersey, the George Washington and Verrazano Narrows bridges, Ellis Island, the bridges to Queens and Brooklyn, and so much more, section by section, connecting the city together in pencil. Now, you can see and even purchase a print of this at Stephen's website, stephenwiltshire.co.uk, and I will link that website in the show notes. You'll also see his drawing of the Eiffel Tower, a panorama of London, the Chicago River, Pershing Square in downtown Los Angeles. He has drawn Hong Kong, Rome, Frankfurt, Madrid, Dubai, Jerusalem, and more. His drawing of Tokyo required a canvas more than 32 feet long. Stephen's talents have been featured in books. They've been displayed in fine art galleries and elsewhere. He drew a 2010 panorama of Sydney, Australia to raise awareness and money for Autism Spectrum Australia, a terrific charity. And he is the subject of a 2019 documentary film called Billions of Windows. Yeah, you need to see this guy's work. And I think you should start with that first city drawing that I mentioned a second ago. The great city of New York, drawn in astounding detail over 4 days. And when you look at it, remember this fact. Stephen Wiltshire didn't shoot reference photographs from the air. He shot photographs with his brain. Stephen has a photographic mind, and when he drew almost the entire city of New York way back in 2009, he did it all from memory after looking at those buildings from above in one helicopter ride that lasted 20 minutes. Man, the early days of commercial air travel were really something. And not just because humanity had entered this exciting new world of travel in the skies. 20th century commercial planes were also little tubes of sexism. The first ever commercial flight happened on the 1st of January 1914 from St. Petersburg to Tampa. Decades later, in the 1960s, commercial flight was well established, with airlines like TWA, Pan American, Continental, and of course many of the names that you and I see today. Yet most of the 20th century was largely a man's world, with glass ceilings in corporate culture. Working women paid less than men, commonly expected to stay home, cook, clean, raise the kids, serve the husband. They were also, of course, objects to be ogled. So let's say that it was the 1930s and you were a female applying for work as a stewardess, which was the common term at the time. Today it's flight attendant. Early airlines had strict appearance guidelines for women, as reported by the New York Times in 1936. Girls who qualified for hostesses had to be petite, 100 to 118 pounds, 5 feet tall to 5'4", ages 20 to 26. Women would be subjected to physical examinations 4 times a year to ensure that they still had the, quote, bloom of perfect health. In other words, flight attendants in the 1930s were required to be female, young, and hot. I wonder if men wrote those rules. Air travel had really opened up after the Second World War. The role of stewardess was often seen as a glamorous profession. Be gorgeous and see the world. But still, flight attendants were required to be young, beautiful, white, heterosexual, feminine, and very put together. The perception of America's perfect woman. If you gained too much weight or you crossed the age of 35, congratulations, you're fired. Uniforms were what you might expect. Form-fitting dresses, often short skirts, and high heels. Imagine walking the aisles in those at high altitudes. And you can imagine the avalanche of sexual harassment that these women endured. And imagine this scenario. From 1953 to 1970, United Airlines offered men-only executive flights between New York and Chicago and between Los Angeles and San Francisco. Women and children were forbidden to fly on those planes. Just men. Males whose perceptions of maleness were molded by the often unenlightened attitudes of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The perfectly made-up stewardesses ensured that those men would be properly doted on. They wore their form-fitting miniskirts. They served up hot coffee, steaks, and cocktails. They even offered complimentary cigars. The planes were wired for the male business world. Before liftoff and after touchdown, businessmen could have flight attendants be their secretaries, going to the back of the plane to make calls to clients from the plane telephone. Stewardesses also helped to provide teletype printouts with closing market prices delivered to the pampered patriarchs in their comfy chairs. And these amenities were how United marketed these flights to men, with newspaper ads showing male masters of the universe on the planes, smoking pipes, playing cards, drinking alcohol, and being served by pretty girls in pretty dresses. Of course, sexism has always been with us, and even after women's rights movements spearheaded rule improvements toward a more egalitarian corporate culture in the 80s and 90s, on the ground and in the skies today, female flight attendants remain in the crosshairs of staring eyes and groping hands. The Association of Flight Attendants Union, representing 50,000 people, still says that harassment is everywhere. It happens every hour of every day, proving that even at 37,000 feet, some minds remain in the gutter. But still, I suppose we have come a fair distance from Man Air, that 17-year span where males filled the planes and females literally fed their notions of manhood. The next time you fly, thank a flight attendant. Any and all flight attendants. They will tell you that their job is difficult and demanding, with days away from home and exhausting service to thousands of strangers every single week. They endure the leers of men still locked in those antiquated notions of sex and sexism. And if you are one of those guys who insist on being a guy, hey, perhaps the window will provide a more appropriate view. And that is a true story.
TrueStoriesPodcast.com.
Oh, I've got more fun, interesting, bizarre, and entertaining, or hopefully entertaining, true stories for you. We continue next. You are listening to an assembling of real stuff, things that happened with real people, science, history, trivia, and more. It is kind of a one after the other rapid fire series of true stories. I'm Seth Andrews, and what you're about to hear is a true story. 1991, the University of Cambridge, England. Two innovative men invented something so unique, so novel, so groundbreaking, so useful that you and I would see around 8 billion versions of their invention in use all around the world today. The webcam. These two researchers worked in a 7-story computer lab at Cambridge, and they were trying to make a locally networked surveillance camera that would broadcast video from one location to computer monitors throughout the entire building. Now, this seems so quaint today, so easy to do. Modern webcams are built into our entire lives, our home and office computers, even our cell phones, and they're amazing technology. Full color, 4K resolution, enhancements to take out the background or add decorations, all kinds of bells and whistles. But this was way back in 1991. The time when radio stations were playing both grunge bands and Color Me Bad. Converse was the popular tennis shoe. The Soviet Union was dissolving. The big computers at that time, the Apple II, the Commodore 64, the Radio Shack TRS-80, standard IBM Office computers. PCs often ran on Windows 3.0, the installation of which required 7 separate disks that would be loaded one after the other into a drive. Installation could take hours, and the National Science Foundation had just opened the Internet for commercial use, introducing the World Wide Web and eventually connecting billions of us in real time. 1991. This was the time of the Intel 486 microprocessor, where a 25 megahertz processor speed and 4 meg of memory were revolutionary. Now compare that, 25 megahertz then to 4 gigahertz today. 4 meg of memory then to perhaps 32 gig of RAM today. It's funny, computer culture a quarter century ago was both the time of enlightenment and the Dark Ages. And something like a networked camera sending a single video feed to a building of computer users, nothing like that had ever been done before. But these researchers, Quentin Stafford Fraser and Paul Jardetsky at the University of Cambridge, set themselves to make a webcam so they could give their fellow researchers the ability to surveil the happenings at point A, streaming to their individual monitors at points B, C, D, etc. Quentin wrote the software using the X Window System protocol. Paul wrote the server program. The camera feed was a staggering 129 grayscale pixels, and it wasn't actually video. This camera would only be able to snap 3 photos a minute to send up the chain. And remember, this was 2 years before web browsers could even display images. So Fraser and Jardetsky had to write a specific program just to allow visuals to stream to everybody's computer. But they did it They built it, they programmed it, they activated it, they connected researchers and academics in a 7-story Cambridge computer lab to a 3-frame-a-minute webcam feed that these people would obsess over. They would obsess over it, and not just because of the groundbreaking technology. You see, computer innovation, code writing, etc., these things require lots of hours behind a computer, hard work requiring a focused brains which crave stimulation. But people were tired of walking the whole building to one specific break room only to find that the coffee pot was empty. That's right. The first webcam was built so that a building full of Cambridge researchers could see if there was any coffee made before they got up and walked all the way down to fill their mugs. Programmer Quentin Stafford Fraser actually called his custom program X-Coffee, and it saved thousands and thousands and thousands of needless steps down halls and stairways. It also let everybody know when someone needed to make fresh coffee. The X-Coffee camera has become part of technology history. It actually has its own wiki page. It is listed on Computer History Chronologies. And when that laboratory was moved in 2001, the primitive little webcam, the first webcam, was finally switched off for the very last time. The story of that turning off was covered in the Times, the Washington Post, and elsewhere. The last of that series of coffee machines in that break room monitored by webcam, the last one was eventually sold to a German news website via eBay. It was restored and switched on in the magazine's editorial office, and that coffee maker now sits in the Heinz Nixdorf Museum. Oh, what a marriage! Coffee and the ability to see remotely whether or not the coffee is made. That love of the sacred Java provided the launch point for the webcam we use today in Zoom meetings, webcasts, FaceTime with family and friends, all of that from Coffee Cam. The late author and humorist Terry Pratchett once said, "Coffee is a way of stealing time that should by rights belong to your older self." 35 years ago, 2 Cambridge programmers bought time for 7 floors of coffee drinkers. How could they know way back then that their coffee cam would change the world? Would you rather be popular in people's minds, or would you rather be popular in terms of usefulness? Well, this is the dilemma of one of the most used typefaces in the world, Comic Sans. Comic Sans is a sans serif typeface. It was first produced in 1994. Of course, a serif is that small line or stroke that's attached to the end of a larger stroke in a font. Serif fonts often look a lot more regal. For some, a serif-free or sans serif typeface just looks unsophisticated. And Comic Sans has really sent the snobs over the edge. This typeface was first introduced way back in the 1990s with the Windows 95 Plus pack. It was conjured up by a Microsoft designer, a man named Vincent Conner. It was inspired by the lettering in the comic books that he had in his house, specifically The Dark Knight Returns and The Watchmen. He was developing a text style for a speech bubble for a Windows 95 program. It was a help program with a little cartoon dog. So if you had a question or you couldn't find something, you would ask Rover, and a cartoon speech bubble would pop up. And for Rover, Vincent wanted an appropriate typeface vibe. Vincent had seen other fonts used in cartoon speech bubbles, usually Times New Roman. A business font, it just looked off. He wanted something more playful and friendly, targeted to younger people who were totally into these fancy new computers. But his Comic Sans creation was not originally intended for anything really beyond Rover and the Windows 95 help function. So imagine Vincent's surprise when Comic Sans started showing up in formal documents and workplaces around the world, in business letters, brochures, school papers. Advertisers were using it on signs and promotions, even these big highway billboards. A cartoon typeface had left its bubble and gone mainstream. But oh, the haters. They came out of the woodwork. Comic Sans. This uncouth, unclean, commoner typeface. It was so beneath them. And it wasn't long before hating on Comic Sans became a kind of sport. Just a few years ago, according to an article on myfonts.com, one of the head designers at Twitter had tweeted that the use of Comic Sans was the number 2 complaint taking up their server space. The number 2 complaint from people. Number 1, the airline industry. Interestingly, number 3 was Justin Bieber. But the overall complaint seems to be that if someone reads something that looks too cartoony, they trust what they are reading much less. There is an entire book just about fonts. It was written by Simon Garfield and published in 2012. It's called Just My Type. And it opens up our world and our eyes to the design, the flair, the nuance, the arts of the letters that you and I type every single day. The book is a history of and a love letter to typefaces, which are now more than 500 years old, hearkening back to the invention of the printing press. If you browse Simon's book, I would wager you will never see a street sign or a building logo, a movie poster, a convention program, or even an everyday email without noticing the serifs or the lack of serifs, whether it's small, medium, large, regular, bold, italic, and the subtle and even not so subtle power of these characters in the things we read. For being so small, the font sure does a lot of heavy lifting. There are over 200,000 fonts out there. The first sans serif typeface was invented in 1816 by a printing pioneer named William Caslon IV. The first digital fonts originated with none other than Steve Jobs. Before he left college to go co-found Apple, he took classes in calligraphy. The early Macintosh computers had fonts that Steve Jobs made, naming them after his favorite cities: Chicago, Toronto, Geneva, etc. The first machine-printed and mass-produced Bible was the Gutenberg Bible. This was pressed in 1455 in Germany. The font was Textura. Helvetica is really popular today. By the way, Helvetica is the Latin word for the place of its creation, Switzerland. When man landed on the moon, NASA needed a font for its aluminum plaque that the astronauts left right there on the surface of the moon during Apollo 11. It is no surprise that they picked a 20th century typeface called Futura. Oh, but Comic Sans, it was never a consideration. And even now, for almost every application, those who may even secretly like Comic Sans may be just too nervous to admit it out loud. But perhaps it is time for us to take a stand against the bullies, the shamers, the haters. Maybe we should start typing this underdog font loud and proud. And to all of those who remain stuck in their snarkiness and snobbishness, I leave you today with one simple question. Beyond assisting a cartoon dog who was assisting computer users, and beyond not taking itself too seriously and spreading a little cheer out there, what did Comic Sans ever do to you? Here's a piece of trivia that I was not aware of. Did you know that it is forbidden for a British monarch to sit, even for a second, even casually, even when invited to do so? It is forbidden for a British monarch to sit on the throne of another king or queen. I did not know this. Well, that fact relates to a widely reported story involving perhaps the most famous royal in recent history. She was Queen of the United Kingdom and other Commonwealth realms from February 6, 1952 until her death, September 8th of 2022. The monarch of 32 sovereign states and 15 realms. On the throne for 70 years and 214 days, Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, or Queen Elizabeth II. 8 years before her death, she had been touring another great hall in Northern Ireland, paying a visit to the royal estate of another, not of the British realm. And she was taking in the history and hearing the stories and doing and saying queenly things. And she was so respected and so admired by her hosts that they invited her to sit on the throne of another king. But for reasons of royal protocol, Queen Elizabeth politely refused, because the ancient rules for the royal family specifically said sitting on the throne of another might be considered an act of aggression. Oh, but they continued to encourage her, please go ahead, it's totally fine. Yet Queen Elizabeth would only smile and remain standing. Now, whether or not you support the idea of a royal family, we have to admit the institution and its people have been the centerpiece of some remarkable history. Of course, you and I, who have followed some of the shenanigans of the royal family throughout history, have seen kings and queens and princes and princesses involved in some interesting scandals, but Elizabeth herself remained mostly above it all. Her coronation on the 2nd of June, 1953, would be the first ever televised coronation ceremony for a British royal. Tens of millions would tune in to watch this new queen be crowned and take her throne. The only throne suitable for a British monarch, which was the reason that 64 years later she would politely refuse to take a seat on that other throne inside that other great hall in Northern Ireland. But wouldn't it have been something to see? Queen Elizabeth II sitting there, perhaps being photographed for posterity, at rest in the great seat inside the throne room of the Red Keep in the city of King's Landing, which of course is not a real city. It's a set. And right there inside that set, she was surrounded not with the royal subjects of another actual king, but with actors and producers, screenwriters, directors, all of them surrounding this famous seat of power. Forged at the order of Aegon the Conqueror, first of the kings of the House Targaryen, fashioned from the swords of the king's vanquished enemies, and located right there in the Red Keep's Great Hall at King's Landing. That's right. Queen Elizabeth was playfully invited to, for just a moment, feel a different kind of power. The kind craved by ambitious schemers throughout the 7 kingdoms, by taking her place on the Iron Throne from the television series Game of Thrones. I've got 3 more of these things on the way. Another 20 minutes of true stuff that happened in our history. Hang on. Your support is appreciated. Thanks for being a part of this community and for becoming a patron. And if you are not a patron, check out patreon.com/Seth Andrews. And here we go with our final round of true stories. Is there anything more magical than a beautifully made wedding dress? Of course, beauty is subjective, and I think we have all attended ceremonies where we looked up and thought, this doesn't quite work for me, whether it's the wedding dress or the bridesmaids' gowns or the tuxedos on the groom and groomsmen. Certainly it's not our choice, it's all subjective, but something didn't quite hit. Well, I can imagine how my wife and I might have reacted if we had attended the December 2019 wedding of a British woman. She decided to go with an Italian theme. An Italian theme, and I'm going to come back to this in just a second. Honestly, it's kind of fun when brides and grooms decide to mix things up, to do something out of the box, even the weird and the wild, and there are real examples out there that would be impossible to forget. There was one woman, she decided she wanted her wedding to have flower power. Her entire wedding gown was all carnations. From neck to floor, white and pink carnations. I couldn't help but think of the movie Midsummer. A bride in Las Vegas decided to go full Vegas. She got married as a showgirl in a silvery one-piece revealing long legs and high heels. Her headdress was amazing. In fact, it was taller than her actual head, and stitched to her back were gigantic angel wings. About 10 years ago, the Times-Union reported a trend for brides who were also avid hunters. They could opt out of the veil and instead, at their ceremony, walk the aisle wearing deer antlers. In 2016, the Today Show featured a way that you could have your cake and eat it too. It was a wedding dress totally made out of cake. Now, this one was not actually wearable. It was a sculpture, but still, the wettable dress was something to behold and then consume. There was an actual edible dress. It was worn by a bride who showed up for photographs looking like Candyland. The gown was made with meringue flowers, swirling macaroon dots, and a headpiece made from lollipops. One woman with a sense of humor called her custom gown the I Need a Drink dress. The whole thing was a walking minibar. All around the long skirt was a frame with cup holders slotted for 30 mimosas, complete with little umbrellas. And after she walked the aisle, she served her guests. In 2015, students at the Miami International University of Art and Design Fashion created a classic dress called McD Couture. It was made entirely of McDonald's food packaging, 900 white sandwich wrappers, 60 yellow sandwich wrappers, and 20 fry boxes that were flattened out and wrapped around her waistline as a belt. You know, I wonder if these wrappers had been previously used. Can you imagine the model bride smelling like a Happy Meal? That same year, ABC News and other outlets reported on a contest which took place in the city of New York, the 11th annual toilet paper wedding dress contest. 1,500 people entered, showing off gowns made from nothing except Charmin toilet paper, tape, glue, and thread. I am guessing you did not want to get these things wet. And of course, that British bride who went with the Italian theme, Her gown was designed to look exactly like a pepperoni pizza. The fabric of the entire dress was a pizza print in the colors and shapes of pizza, with white yellow shades of cheese, the train spotted with huge circles designed with the texture of pepperoni, and a stitched brown border resembling a crunchy baked crust. Why would the couple do this? Well, both of their families had long enjoyed a weekly pizza night. This was a tradition they had enjoyed with their parents and one they had passed on to their children. Pizza was simply a way of life, and it seemed like a way to get married. That bride got a lot of ridicule on social media for choosing something so tacky. But hey, it's her moment, it's her dress, it's her choice. And of course, beauty is in the pie of the beholder. (1939). The war between Finland and Soviet Russia is known by historians and a few history buffs, but it is not really talked about much for obvious reasons. The world was facing down the threats from Hitler's Germany and Japan's ambitions to expand its empire, and so Finland, a tiny country of about 4 million, going head-to-head with its gigantic Russian neighbor, well, that's a story that often gets lost in the shadows. But this situation would become known as the Winter War. Finland had just gained independence, or a kind of independence from Russia after World War I. But in October of 1939, Joseph Stalin demanded the right to establish military bases and revise borders. The Baltic states submitted. Finland would not. So Russia decided it would take what it wanted by force. And this was supposed to be an easy victory for the Soviet Union. But oh, they were in for a big surprise. Beyond the brutal cold in those lands just above the Arctic Circle, with the ice and snow and frostbite and terrain and the fierce Finland resistors, the Russian army came to encounter a man of only 5'3", who would himself be his own army from the trigger end of a sniper rifle. His name was Simo Häyhä. Snipers have great utility in times of war. They can keep large numbers of enemy soldiers pinned down as everybody fears being the next victim. The sniper looks his victims in the face. The targeting is individual. The kills are personal. Few things can demoralize an army like a well-hidden and accurate sniper. You wouldn't think that a guy who was once a simple Finnish farm boy would generate all that fear, but this seventh son of 8 children learned to shoot out on the farm. Simo was familiar with the dense forest and changing elements of the outdoors. When he joined the local civil guard at the age of 17, it was immediately apparent he was gifted with a rifle. His room was filled with trophies from shooting competitions. This guy could hit a small target 6 times in a row in 1 minute from 150 meters using just a bolt-action rifle. 2 years later, in 1925, he started his mandatory 15-month military service. He qualified for formal sniper training in 1927, and he joined his comrades to battle Russia in the 1939 war. His condition for joining was that he be allowed to use his old training school rifle. And his commanders agreed. That gun, an M2830 7.62 caliber weapon, would go on to make history. Simo aimed at his targets using only iron sights. He did not want to use a scope. He said the scope might reflect the sun and expose his position. Sometimes he would put snow in his mouth to keep his exhaled breath from being noticed by the enemy. And from his concealed positions across the field of battle, Simo Häyhä sent death to Russian soldiers like no one else. His average, more than 5 kills per day. His highest total for a single day, 25. And the kill count didn't include those that he dispatched with a submachine gun, a whole other kind of war he was waging as a single soldier fighting for Finland. Now, the targets weren't hard to spot. Russian troops, for some reason, were assigned brown uniforms in a snow-covered battlefield, while Finnish troops cloaked themselves in white. The Russians were sometimes ordered to attack while crossing frozen lakes. Many of the vehicles, the tanks and trucks, would actually crack down into the freezing water through the ice. Russian morale was very low. And yet, on the Finland side, Simo Häyhä's story was a morale booster throughout the country. This guy was lethal, he was effective, he was successful. And yet, in March of 1940, he would prove mortal, as a Russian explosive detonated right next to him, shrapnel striking his head. It was assumed that Simo was dead until a fellow soldier saw his leg moving slightly. With his left cheek and much of his upper jaw blown off of his head, and with so much loss of blood, it seemed unlikely he would survive. But after 14 months and 25 surgeries, Simo lived. And for his actions in battle, he was commissioned a lieutenant and ultimately given the prestigious Knight of the Mannerheim Cross Award. He was disfigured for life, but he never complained, and he would live to the age of 96, passing away in 2002. In any context, it would be remarkable that a single soldier could amass so many sniper kills in a single deployment, so many that he would become known by his nickname, the White Death. 505 confirmed kills. But what's even more interesting is that Simo Häyhä, one man with an iron sight and snow in his mouth, carried out those 505 kills in just over 3 months. For obvious reasons, Simo Häyhä, the White Death, is considered the most lethal sniper in history. 29-year-old Steve Callahan had designed and built his very own sailboat. And that sailboat had a purpose. He was going to sail a transatlantic race that was known as the Mini Transat. The starting point was Penzance, Cornwall, England. There would be a stopover in the Canary Islands and then on to the finishing point at Antigua, thousands and thousands of miles on the ocean, with a certain class of boats. Steve and the other captains were sailing something called a sloop. This would be a relatively small boat with a single mast. It had sails fore and aft, and there would be one person on board. The captain was the crew. This was the boat that belonged to Steve until it was soon claimed by the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Steve had christened his vessel the Napoleon Solo, and as he was an American, he sailed out of Rhode Island toward the starting point in England. That's thousands of miles just to get there, and the event had not even started. But he did arrive, and in January of 1982, he lined up with all of the other captains to kick off the great Mini Transat Solo race. And when I say solo, I mean solo. It's just you in the ocean, in a potentially homemade or experimental boat. No external help with navigation, no computers, no satellite link, no contact with the outside world, with maybe one exception. The boats had a single short-range radio that would allow captains to talk to each other if they were close by, maybe a range of 10 miles, and that was it. January 1982, the race began, and Steve and the others headed out, southbound from Cornwall toward Tenerife. But the weather turned nasty. The boats got kicked around. Some were damaged. A few of them sank. The captains rescued. Steve's boat had taken a pretty serious beating, so he limped to La Coruña, Spain, to make repairs. After he got fixed up, then it was down the coast of Spain and Portugal, out to Madeira and the Canary Islands. After that began the long North Atlantic journey to the finish line. Antigua in the Caribbean, over 4,000 miles, floating on 45 feet of do-it-yourself construction. He started his last leg of that journey on the 29th of January, 1982, and it was smooth sailing for the first week. But then the weather turned, and Steve's sailboat was ravaged by gale-force winds. He managed to keep it afloat, to keep moving westward, but then, on the night of February 4th, Steve suddenly heard and felt a deafening smash into the boat. Possibly a large shark, or maybe a whale, something big, something solid, whatever it was. It had ripped the hull of the boat wide open, and the ocean was pouring in. So there in the dark, on the sinking Napoleon Solo, Steve scrambled. His only choice was evacuation. He grabbed the inflation tabs on the life raft. He tethered that raft to the boat, and then, as it continued to fill up with water, he desperately went back and forth from raft to boat, harvesting as much as he could. And it's impressive how much he was able to salvage. A piece of cushion, a sleeping bag. He got the emergency kit, which had food, navigation charts, a flashlight, solar stills for making drinking water, a small spear gun, and even a book, a survival manual. By the time dawn arrived, Steve Callahan had separated from his sunken sailboat. He was drifting on that raft, westward with the ocean current. Now, the rescue raft did have a radio beacon, but the aircraft passing overhead, well, they were too far away to pick up the signal. The raft had a flare gun, and Steve would fire that gun as 9 different ships would ultimately pass nearby, but none saw the light of those flares. So there he was, on the water in the middle of nowhere. Steve wasn't just looking for an island. Steve was the island, unseen, unheard, totally by himself, and he knew what that meant. So the sailor became a survivalist with a plan. Those solar stills and some fresh rain provided drinking water. He rationed himself to just 1 cup of water a day. He was able to catch some fish with the spear gun. He mapped out a daily routine. He would stretch and exercise. He would use the sun and the stars for navigation as he tried to push himself with the oars as best he could. Day and night, Steve drifted with the winds and the currents. And the days passed. Steve's body began to deteriorate. He was sunburned and covered in saltwater sores. His equipment started to break. He had to constantly fix punctures in his raft. At one point, he was surrounded by sharks. But never underestimate the survival instinct, the will to live. That may have been the most important tool Steve used on his Atlantic drift, day and night, until April the 20th, 1982, just southeast of Guadalupe. Steve was discovered and rescued by fishermen who quickly rushed him to shore and then off to the hospital. He made a full recovery in the weeks after, and Steve would go on to keep sailing for years to come. In the book that he wrote about his experience, Steve Callahan talked about those nights under the stars. He called what he had seen a view of heaven from a seat in hell. And I can't really argue with the hell part, given how many days he was adrift. Back in 1982, Steve's sailboat sank Friday, February 5th. He was rescued on Tuesday, April 20th. I don't know, could you do it? Could you survive out there for 76 days? Steve Callahan did. Retrieved and rescued after drifting alone on a raft in the ocean for 2.5 months. You probably know what a death mask is. I'll get into the deeper backstory in just a moment, but I am most interested today in what is arguably the most seen, replicated, and publicly known death mask in history. It has also been the most kissed. The peaceful mold of La Conway de la Seine. Nobody knows her name, but I'll bet you have seen her face. Even long before the mummifications of ancient Egypt, death masks had been made. Before photography was invented, death masks were a way of preserving the detailed physical features of someone who had passed away. A drawing, a painting, or any two-dimensional replications just couldn't capture who that person had been like a 3D casting would. Death masks have been used to help record the faces of anonymous and soon-to-be buried corpses in case families were out there looking for a missing person. They were used for honor and memory. They gave continued life to royalty and nobility. Death masks have been made of iconic figures like Beethoven, Napoleon, Oliver Cromwell, Nikola Tesla, Richard Wagner, even the French philosopher Voltaire. The less famous have also been immortalized, or at least memorialized in wax, plaster, or some other hardening material. The hands of babies who died in childbirth, criminals whose remains were studied by medical science, and everyday people who died, young and old, their only remaining identities forever sleeping or staring into future generations. Who was the unidentified female that you and I know so well today, even if we don't know that we know her? Who is La Conway de la Seine? Well, the cast itself dates back to the late 1800s. It is of a teenage girl who may have died by her own hand for whatever reason. Her body had been found and retrieved from the Seine River. There were no markings or signs of trauma upon the body, hence the suspicion she may have taken her own life. The pathologist at the Paris morgue saw her, and he was apparently so struck by her beauty that right there he made a death mask out of wax. That mold would soon be replicated, then embraced and displayed by others who were also captured by her beauty, her serenity, her peacefulness. The French philosopher Albert Camus would compare her smile to that of the Mona Lisa. That smile, with closed eyes, even features, and serene expression, became the inspiration for many stories and works of art. At the time, some women were said to fashion their own style to match hers. Go ahead, Google the image. Google the death mask of the unknown woman of the Seine. See the face, that peaceful face. Imagine who she might have been, what she might have been thinking, how she had lived, and why she had died. Wonder what she might have thought about her unintended immortality and celebrity being compared to art displayed as art well into the 21st century, and also being the most kissed face in the world. And I'll bet you've kissed this face yourself. If you have ever taken CPR training, Back in 1960, two men, Asmund Lerdahl and Peter Safar, introduced the first medical simulator for teaching CPR. It was a mannequin, which they called the Rhesussi Annie doll. Lerdahl had been a toy maker. When his son was only 2 years old, the boy had fallen into water and drowned, and Lerdahl had saved his son using CPR, and he became convinced that others could save lives as well if only they could be taught the technique. How would they do so? They needed a mannequin. A mannequin with a peaceful face that would make students feel less uncomfortable. And so Lerdahl and Safar used the death mask of the anonymous teenager to mold their life-saving teaching tool. And since its introduction, the anonymous face of a girl from the 1800s has met the lips of millions and millions, people who have no idea they are breathing a simulated kiss of life on a famous face in death. So the next time you see somebody using that life-size CPR doll to learn the technique, let them know they just kissed the mysterious beauty, the anonymous teenager, the unknown woman of the Seine. And that's a true story.
TrueStoriesPodcast.com.
I hope those were fun for you. I've often heard the saying, the truth is stranger than fiction. I don't know if that's true or not, but I don't know. There's some wild, fun, entertaining, crazy stuff out there that's part of our history and part of our culture, and those are often the stories I like to tell. So appreciate you being here. Be safe, and I will see you back here next time.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter for a complete archive of podcasts and videos, products like mugs and t-shirts featuring the Thinking Atheist logo, links to atheist pages and resources, and details on upcoming Free Thought events and conventions. Log on to our website, thethinkingatheist.com.